Alright, this is part 2 of my series looking at Carl Baugh's Creation in the 21st Century. This episode is entitled Hugged by a Canopy and features Dr. Larry Mitcham.
Now back to the problem. You and I both in the past have embraced evolution.
That's correct.
We do not currently embrace evolution.
But didn't he say in the intro that medical evidence suggests that evolution benefits from being embraced more frequently than we are prone to do in this decadent generation?
And that was a strain. Trying to ride the evolutionary horse and ride the Christian horse and read the book of the Bible and believe and study and learn and believe in both at the same time was confusing and conflicting.
And that generates chaos in the very mindset of the individual.
So that's interesting that they see a religious belief and an acceptance of the scientific theory of evolution as being in conflict. That seems to be their issue, but not one with what I see, the majority of Christians worldwide. I'm gonna read a little bit from a project called the Clergy Letter Project, which was started in 2005, I believe, and was a letter authored by a Lutheran minister and biologist, then subsequently signed by, I think at this point in time, it's almost 15,000 different ordained clergy of predominantly Christian faiths, but also including rabbis and a few other Judeo-Christian traditions in it. And I'm going to read just a little piece of this right here, and I'll put a link down below where you can see the letter yourself in full. It's actually a pretty incredible statement, in my opinion. We, the undersigned Christian clergy from many different traditions, believe that the timeless truths of the Bible and the discoveries of modern science may comfortably coexist. We believe that the theory of evolution is a foundational scientific truth, one that has stood up to rigorous scrutiny and upon which much of human knowledge and achievement rests. To reject this truth or to treat it as one theory among others is to deliberately embrace scientific ignorance and transmit such ignorance to our children. We believe that among God's good gifts are human minds capable of critical thought, and the failure to fully employ this gift is a rejection of the will of our Creator. It's a pretty remarkable statement, in my opinion, and one that should be applauded.
Now, let's explain just a bit. Larry and I both agree that within genetic boundaries, there certainly are variations. If you want to call that microevolution, that is no problem. That's all within genetic boundary. But the addition of new information producing an entirely new life form is absolutely impossible.
Carl Baugh is actually saying something true here. Change outside of genetic boundaries, essentially outside of created kinds, is indeed impossible, as is the addition of new information to the genome. Now you might say, why in the hell are you saying that? Why in the hell are you agreeing with him? Because those things are indeed impossible with the definitions that Carl Baugh and his crowd allow for. Now I'm going to explain this. So, one kind cannot change into another kind. You cannot have something changing. So, what's the definition of a kind? Well, that's a defined unit, a group, a species, or a family, or a genus, or sometimes a phyla, outside of which nothing can ever change to leave that. If you do observe it, if we observe something changing to a different kind by their definition, the definition of kind then changes to embrace the new change. So therefore, kind is defined as that something which something cannot change into or outside of, if that makes sense. So it essentially becomes a constantly moving goalpost that can never be properly defined. So therefore, by their definition, it is indeed impossible. Now, adding new information to the genome is impossible. Well, what is information? Information is defined as something that cannot be added to a genome. So, if we say, well, look at this bacterium, was it Flavobacter, duplicated its genome and then duplicated a gene and then changed one of the copies of that gene to a new thing, which now it contains information which didn't exist before. I say, well, no, that's not addition of new information. Why? Because it was added to the genome, and new information cannot be added to the genome. It's impossible. You see what I'm saying here? So any examples of change with outside of kind, any examples of speciation, any examples of addition of new information are defined as meaningless. So, yep, impossible. He's right.
Now, let's get to the problem that the evolutionary community has generated for us, and it has to do with some of the benefits of the canopy that the evolutionary community just ignores altogether. Some of the explanations for the great creatures we call the dinosaurs.
Carl Baugh is right. We do not take into account the beneficial aspects of this crystalline canopy when we're looking at ecological models of the Earth, especially paleoecology. Just like we don't take into account the greenhouse effects of 4 gigantic elephants, the flatulence from the 4 gigantic elephants that the disk of the Earth is suspended on. We don't take that into account either in hardly any climatology models. And in fact, there's probably well over 100 million other little pieces of bullshit made-up things that people believe in or have believed in throughout recorded human history that aren't taken into account in scientific models. I'm not sure why Baugh thinks his little made-up piece of bullshit is somehow special.
Great creatures we call the dinosaurs. Larry, you work a lot in your physics and your chemistry and your engineering. You know a lot about pressure and chambers and saturation. What about the lungs of the great dinosaurs?
They're not as big in proportion as our lungs are per body weight. Not only that, to their detriment, some have tremendously long airways, which they have to pull this oxygenated air through, and it must return in all exhaust before the next breath can come in. In addition to that, some, like the Apatosaurus, the larger sauropods, have nostrils no larger than a racehorse, no larger than a quarter horse, a 600 or 700 pound animal, and they are trying to oxygenate, in some cases, 80,000 pounds of mass of meat and blubber and blood.
40 tons.
Yes.
And the hydraulics involved as well, which would require a tremendous amount of metabolic oxygen being consumed. Okay, continue.
I love it when these guys play scientist. I think it's kind of cute in its own way. Although this guy, I have a hard time putting much faith in him because he doesn't have a safari outfit on. But that's just me. So he's doing what a good creationist does, good creatortionists do, which is to take little bits of information from a wide temporal span and mash it together and present it as currently accepted, current modern belief, and whatever. And then obviously such facts contradict each other and are open fodder for ridicule. And that's what they're trying to do. So what he's talking about here is this idea that based on the size of Apatosaurus or any of the sauropods, that they were so big that given a reptile physiology, they couldn't breathe fast enough to to move at all. I mean, they simply didn't have the capacity to move. But we know, of course, they weren't really reptiles. They're closer to birds and probably warm-blooded. But that's easy to discount as well, because you take a large warm-blooded animal that we can measure today. Say a horse is a great example of that, or an elephant. But horse is the one that specifically was addressed. And you look at its oxygen requirements. You look at its lung capacity, and you look at how fast it has to breathe, how much ability it has to draw in air, and all of this. And you quickly learn that, just like he says, Apatosaurus simply wasn't capable of breathing in a normal 20% oxygen atmosphere. Now, he'll get to that later on. But let's just, for the time being, stick to a current modern atmosphere. So this is a huge problem. Okay, this thing couldn't breathe. Now that's what he's trying to get to. This is part of this vapor canopy stuff. But what's hilarious about it is that it ignores the fact that we know now. Well, first of all, it's been speculated, and now it's been demonstrated that the sauropods did not have a mammal-like respiratory system any more than they had a reptile-like respiratory system. They had, get this, surprise, surprise, a bird-like respiratory system, which means that they had a whole series of cavities and just a different setup that essentially involves constant breathing. They're not inhaling mouthfuls of air. There's a cycle of air going through. This system that birds have enables them to have a lung capacity significantly smaller than an equal-sized mammal has. So it's been calculated that for an animal the size of Apatosaurus, if it were a mammal respiratory system would have to have lung capacity about almost 3,000 liters, which is larger than the available space to put lungs, so therefore impossible. And that's what he's hinting at here. However, when you compensate and suggest in the avian system, then the lung capacity of Apatosaurus is estimated to only be about 500 to 600 liters required, which fits very well within this chest cavity. So his physiological argument is, again, like everything else, a bunch of bullshit.
It continue.
So where have they all gone? And we think perhaps this oxygen riddle has a lot to do with that. Now, below this picture, and that's what's now known as an Apatosaurus, this artist's conception was of a Brontosaurus, wrongly called, before they put the right head on it.
Yes.
And I learned that from you and the dig team. The explanation below talks about the requirements calculated for this animal to even lumber along.
Now, the audience needs to get this. This is a major problem, and the evolutionary community has not addressed it at all. So go ahead, in order to get sufficient oxygen, go ahead with what you were saying.
Okay, with nostril breathing and even supplemented mouth breathing. I mean, he has to stop eating and breathe through his mouth like a lot of us do today. And we have suffered from oxygen deprivation as well.
Yes.
We're no different than the rest of the animals. He could at best have lumbered along with this kind of mass in a 35% atmosphere, been calculated by many. So the summary on this slide is that perhaps the original oxygen in the atmosphere was something like 40% or even better.
Now, that's a major problem. So the evolutionary community has suggested that in order to
match the track set velocities
Yes.
that we've measured in the fossil record.
and counterbalance this.
Right.
In order to do that, the atmospheric ratio of oxygen saturation must have been around 40%. But that's a major problem.
You've got an Apollo 1 problem there.
You have an Apollo 1 problem. So
I apologize for the long clip, but I wanted you to see what he's doing here. It's just sort of a repeat of what he said before. So what he's talking about now he's reverted back. Now he's gone back into the olden days of when we looked at dinosaurs. We modeled dinosaurs as if they were large reptiles, looking at the metabolism, the physiology of a large reptile. How fast could they move? How fast, because reptiles tend to breathe slow, could they possibly oxygenate their tissues enough to move rapidly or to move semi-rapidly? Now, this is going back to the day when it was believed that the sauropods had to be mostly aquatic. It was believed that with a reptile physiology that they simply weren't capable of supporting their weight and moving very well on land. Let alone now we know they actually could run at a fair pace based on the trackways. So looking at those trackways, which is a modern understanding of how fast they can move, and then applying that based on a reptile physiology, is where he's getting this information about why we would need such a high oxygen. This is not something that evolutionists believe. This is not something that's in any modern textbook. In fact, it's a combination of information, again, from 40 years ago, combined with modern interpretations of pace and walking methodology. And he's mixing it together and then creating a problem that doesn't exist at all. He doesn't talk about the avian respiratory system that these things had that would have given them all of the energy they need. Even in today's atmosphere, they would have been adequately oxygenated to move along at the pace that we observe from the trackways. So it's a complete nonsense thing that he's coming up with here. But then again, if you guys have anybody been watching this series or familiar with creationist stuff across the board, making up nonsense is nothing new to them, and this is just simply nothing different. Now I'm gonna end this now because he gets into my favorite part of this entire video is going to be at the beginning of the next part. So I want to you guys please check out part 3, and I'll see you there.